Hello, nerds, and welcome to part 2 of the Industrial Revolution notes. So let's go. All right, this slide here basically sums up the Industrial Revolution. It's not actually just one Industrial Revolution. There's actually many, but in the 19th century, there are two. So the first Industrial Revolution is basically what I covered in the previous Industrial Revolution notes. So to summarize, you can basically divide it into three sections. The mass production of textiles using the factory system on unskilled labor using women and children. We'll really get into the women and children actually in this next set here. The use of coal to fire the steam engines, which of course will lead us into the new invention of the railways, train systems. That's all the first Industrial Revolution. The second Industrial Revolution is later 19th century into the early 20th century, and this is like your invention of chemicals, the actual harnessing of electricity to be able to produce electricity, and transportation that is based off of the use of electricity. So the chemicals, these will be particularly important, especially with like household goods. Some of these chemicals you actually might be familiar with your chemistry classes, like sulfuric acid. Chemical fertilizers will be really important down the line. Additionally, some of these chemicals will eventually be connected to the use of poison gas during World War I, which occurs between 1914 and 1918. So the Second Industrial Revolution has a direct connection to World War I. Electricity, immensely important in human history. I don't think I need to go into why, but in particular, they're eventually going to harness electricity to make the first underground train system in the world. The London Underground, the Tube, or Americans might call it the subway. But the British are the first people to put a train underground, and that's wicked important to have fast transportation in these overcrowded cities. The streetlights these gas streetlights get replaced by electric streetlights because, folks, electric is much more safe than gas. And eventually we're going to see like electric trams, basically trains inside of cities that you can kind of hop on. Other stuff, the connection to the World War I that I just mentioned is immensely important. The Second Industrial Revolution basically fuels World War I. The creation of like rubber. Yes, I know rubber actually comes from the like serum of a rubber tree, but you have to vulcanize that and actually eventually make it into stuff. Hey, how do you have a car without the use of rubber? Also think of like rubber being used in the factory system to make the gears turn. Rubber is wicked important. Of course, the invention of the automobile in Germany by the Benz family. What's different here is they're going to use oil. And of course, oil is going to become the most important commodity ever harnessed by humans. And what they're using the oil to actually make the cars operate is by this new invention called the internal combustion engine, which is still how we make cars operate to the very day in 2023. So that's the Second Industrial Revolution leading into the early 20th century. Know that connection to World War I, especially as maybe context for World War I later on. Really important. Okay, next section. So right in the middle of the 19th century, Britain is by far the wealthiest nation on Earth. They have the largest empire on Earth, and they basically want to show it off. So the queen at the time, her name's Queen Victoria, probably was the second longest running monarch in British history until more recently we had Queen Elizabeth II. And she's going to help fund this like showing off of British industrial and imperial power. So she actually tasked her husband, Prince Albert, to really lead this exhibition. So he hires this guy, Joseph Paxton, to create this crystal palace to house the Great Exhibition of 1851. And it's literally what it sounds like. It is a palace built of glass and iron, and it's huge. It's right in the center of London, pretty close to Hyde Park. And eventually it will be the center of this great exhibition. So basically what it is it was an exhibit of tens of thousands of little like exhibits that really just show off British wealth. But it was also not just British wealth. They had sections for the British East India Company. They actually had sections for British India. But really, it was to show that Britain is the imperial and industrial powerhouse of the world. It was basically one of the first fairs of the world, even though it would be called one of the world's fairs. That's going to be later 19th century. The famous one being in Paris. So if you ever see the Crystal Palace or the Great Exhibition, just know it in the context of showing off British industrial and imperial power, and you'll be all set. All right, some pretty interesting videos, but I'm going to skip them over for now. So here's a drawing of the Crystal Palace. It no longer exists today. It actually burned down in a fire. Okay, now let's get into the social consequences, effects of the Industrial Revolution, and let's start with children. The child labor. So think about child labor laws in the United States. What's really the earliest you can legally work in New York State? It's basically 15 or 16, depending on your working papers, whatever. And, you know, I would say kind of American culture, people are often itching to kind of start working, you know, make some money, pay for your own Netflix subscription, what have you. But I will show you how the use of child labor can be exploited in really the ugliest terms possible. So think about the factories and, of course, the place where you get coal from, which are mines. And those operations are often they require small people. Children are physically smaller than adults. So think of factories. I'm actually going to skip this photograph right here. Look at all these little moving parts. These moving parts have to be replaced. And there's these really small gaps. Kids are physically smaller. They can fit their hands in between these little spindles of yarn here, and an adult really can't. And additionally, why are children useful? Well, you can pay them a fraction of an adult male. And here's the thing, though. You might ask the question, well, why would parents have their kids work in a coal mine or in a textile factory? Well, their families need money, so the risk they're going to take that risk just to make money for the family. So initially, child labor is going to be abused because there is no government regulation to prevent it from happening. There are no safety, security, it's awful. So the mines to me are one of the worst places you can possibly work. So child coal miners, they could start as early as age 8 to 10, really common. And think about, again, why could a kid be useful in a mine? Because mines, you need, physically smaller people to put, I don't know, explosives into place. And initially, they're not using safe explosives like dynamite. Dynamite actually is a safe explosive. Yes, I know that is sort of oxymoronic, but you get the point. They were using something called nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin is a liquid, and usually it's a clear liquid in a glass vial, and it's super volatile, really unstable. And the smallest amount of movement could set that sucker off. And they gave that job to kids. So they're giving kids vials of nitroglycerin in these pitch black mines to put them in these little crevices to then explode them. What if that kid trips and falls and kaboom, kid's dead? So horrifically violent deaths. And additionally, think about the gases their lungs are inhaling. And they're inhaling that stuff in their prime developmental ages. So it will permanently stunt their growth. They will have things called black lung. It is awful. If you want an example of why schools matter, look at the abuse of child labor in the Industrial Revolution. So eventually, the British government creates a commission to study the adverse impact of child labor, and it's called the Sadler Commission. And their report in 1832 to Parliament basically said, kids are dying at really high rates. Their growths are stunted. This is awful. Something needs to change. And eventually, they will set a series of laws to start regulating the use of child labor. So the consequences, as I just mentioned, are pretty awful. Then we're going to see how the British government will remedy this situation. So in these notes, you're going to see the issue, the consequences, and then of course the remedy. So truly, the first major set of laws are going to be called the Factory Acts, and they basically are going to reduce the number of working hours. They will eventually have some safety precautions put into place, but truly the end of the abuse of child labor is the creation of compulsory, required primary school education, where kids had to go to school by law. And that really is late 19th century into early 20th century, and that's really the key. I mean, just look at this kid here. His hand is inches away from this leather belt going at thousands of RPMs. His hand moves just a little bit to the right, and then there goes his, skin off of his hand. And I bet he'd probably be fired for that, by the way, because since there's such a surplus of labor at this point, someone gets injured, they'll just fire them and pick the uninjured person to fill their job. child coal miner. All right, so you can read through these primary source ratings. They're pretty revealing of the abuse of child labor. Okay, so besides child labor, other issues, consequences of industrialization, is just, in general, the bad working conditions, super long hours. On average, the workday was 12 hours. Easily could be up to 14 or 15 hours, and you worked Monday through Saturday. Very few breaks were in that 12-hour day. You basically had like a half-hour, 20-minute lunch, and that was about it. Initially, there are no like safety features on those machines. Like, go back to that previous photo. Like, there is nothing to prevent that machine from accidentally turning on and taking off someone's hand with it. Mines are unregulated. People are inhaling those noxious chemicals. It's awful. Additionally, think of like if you're working for 12 straight hours with one short break for lunch, your mind eventually gets tired and you're more likely to make careless errors when you're tired. So think of that 8-year-old kid holding a vial of nitroglycerin and he's in those mines for 12 straight hours. He's going to mess up at some point and kill people and himself. So, the consequences of long working hours and dangerous conditions, I think, are fairly obvious, as people are going to die. Get mutilated, you get the whole point. Actually, the destruction of family life starts. People are spending so much time in factories, they get home, they're just exhausted, they don't want to talk to their families. So it really begins the disintegration of family structures to a certain extent. So how do they sort of fix this? So Britain will pass a series of famous laws called the Factory Acts, give them like an underline in a circle, and that, for example, they'll have something called the 10 Hours Act, which reduces or gives the longest workday you can possibly have, at least without overtime, was 10 hours. And then they'll eventually they'll make a minimum age for children working in coal mines, and they'll basically just keep increasing it. So they're just a series of laws that just add more government regulation. So a key theme in the Industrial Revolution is the earlier part of it, it's kind of like unfettered capitalism. People are not controlling any form of these laissez-faire practices. Businessmen are taking advantage of this new working class. But then when they see the consequences of laissez-faire economics, the British government starts regulating. They start controlling. They kind of start, they don't like destroy laissez-faire by any means, but they just don't make it completely laissez-faire anymore. And that's key. Eventually, what's going to really help the improvement of working conditions, the creation of trade unions is legalized. They were actually illegal initially. And unions always fight for like better working conditions, better pay. And that's always going to be the case to the very day. And eventually, the urban working class will gain the right to vote in 1867. And of course, the working class are going to probably vote for people who are maybe more conscientious of their plates. All right, another primary source reading. We'll cover CAT POV analysis in class. If we've already done that, feel free to do a CAT POV on this one if you'd like. All right, women, star, circle, underline them. Got to know their connection and their role in the Industrial Revolution. So we know the context. Historically, women were part of the cottage industry system or the domestic system where they would produce textiles in the convenience of their own homes. But then the growth of urbanization, the growth of the factory system now is going to push them out of their homes, and they will be working in factories. So here's the thing. They're going to be working just as long as the men. 12, 14-hour working days. Oh, guess what? They're going to be paid maybe half of an adult male. All right. Then they get home of their 12, 14-hour working day. They are still expected to have dinner for the family, still expected to take care of the children. So they still have that traditional role, that expectation for them. So the Industrial Revolution actually makes the lives of women worse. So they now have a dual burden. So before, they would still be at home and have that traditional role expectation. Now they're working the same amount as the men with half the pay, and then coming home and still having all of those traditional roles associated with them. So it is actually getting twice as worse for women, and that is key. Gotta know it. All right, so will this really be fixed? Not really, to be completely honest. Truly, like, we don't see the lives of women dramatically improve until really post-World War II. That's after 1945. So this dual burden is really going to be the reality for a long time, and arguably there are still quite a few communities, family cultures, that actually have a form of a dual burden. So that really won't be fixed. All right, other consequences. There we go. Urbanization, and really overcrowding. So urbanization is going to now lead to not just crowding cities, but overcrowding of cities. So now think of the health impacts of, 15 people living in a one-room apartment with one bed. So we're going to see shortages of fresh and clean drinking water, which means you're going to have the spread of waterborne diseases, communicable diseases like cholera. There's going to be multiple outbreaks of cholera, which will kill tens of thousands. The cities, since they're using the steam engine, which is powered by coal, are just going to be emitting this black smog into the air, which leads to poor air quality. People are going to have lung diseases over that, and it's getting really bad. The sewage systems, they have not updated their sewage systems yet. Seriously! They have not had a proper sewage system since, well, it depends on the part of Britain we're talking about, really since the Roman Empire. So someone's going to actually make a sewage system for London, starting with and other British cities. So the spread of diseases is going to be rampant during the Industrial Revolution. That's directly connected to the overcrowding. Okay, so how will this overcrowding be fixed? Well, first, you got to deal with the plumbing issue. So the British government hires super famous engineer Joseph Bazalgette, and he creates London's first modern sewage system, and it's immensely successful. Well, sort of. The modern day issue is that the sewage system he built puts all of the sewage directly into the Thames River in London. Yeah, I know. And that, if you actually go to the Thames today, it's pretty disgusting. And they're now actually building a second major sewage system in London as I speak in 2023. But he wasn't the only of these city planners. The British government will hire other city planners to do this in other parts of the British cities. And also France will do the same thing in Paris in the second half of the 19th century. So basically, again, the government is intervening to help quell some of these consequences of the Industrial Revolution. So this is a pretty good reading. I recommend doing it. So give this a read, as well as the second page here. It's some pretty important stuff. All right. So one of the major causes of Britain having to fix their sewage system was something called the Great Stink of London in 1858. So basically, think of London. It rains a lot, and usually it doesn't get super hot, but it can get into the 80s, and more modern day can get into the 90s in London. So basically, London had one of the hottest summers on record in 1858, and there also was a drought too. But to me, drought or rain is still a really bad situation. But basically, think of the primary modes of transportation in 1858. It's still horse. What do you do with the horse's manure? Well, you just kind of put it on the street. Then if it's raining a lot, now that manure is turning into liquid sewage. There are no sewage pipes connected to those apartment buildings called tenements, so people are just dumping their own human sewage onto the streets. So when it's raining, it's just this liquid sewage, ugh, and then it gets really hot. Oh! So if you have a drought, then all that sewage isn't going to be washed away in the first place, and that is what's going to happen in 1858. It's really hot, there's a drought, and the smell in London became so horrific. Some people, depending on the part of London you were in, you couldn't walk outside without vomiting. Parliament literally had to move out of London for a short period of time to meet because the smell was so noxious. So that will really kind of precipitate the British government, making the sewage system for London. Oh, that's a video about what I just kind of said. All right, so other consequences of industrialization. One, I've already mentioned them, but child labor laws. So they're going to put a minimum age on when boys can be working in coal mines, textile mills, what have you, and that's going to be key. When you keep elevating that child age for child labor, that's going to reduce deaths, right? Additionally, you have the 10 Hours Act, which is going to limit the number of hours you can work in the day. So basically, the British government is going to take a more active role in the economy for the benefit of the worker, largely. Additionally, we're going to see more like the devolvement of the right to vote in Britain. They're going to gradually give more and more people the right to vote. Initially, it'll be the middle class, then it'll be the working class, and then eventually agricultural workers. And basically, by 1884, most men in Britain can vote. So I'll have this actually another set of notes, the gradual increase in suffrage in Britain. But that basically will help, British people elect people who are more kind to the working class. Growth of labor unions is hugely important. Eventually, the labor unions will be connected to political parties like the Labour Party. And again, they can always try and fight for the workers' salaries, wages, and of course, better working conditions. Additionally, during the Industrial Revolution, we're going to see the idea of alternatives to this uncontrolled laissez-faire capitalism. We're going to see the growth of ideas of socialism, where the government might control some of those major those industries. So maybe they might control the energy production. Then you have some people who have a different version of factories. So utopian socialism, Robert Owen essentially is going to try and make a community of workers that are happy to produce better quality stuff. Again, that'll be in a different set of notes. So essentially it's a new form of socialism. And then hugely important is Karl Marx's version of communism in 1848, where he basically is arguing for the elimination of private ownership. He wants the entire community to own the means of production. He wants to erase the classes of society. He doesn't want the bourgeoisie, who are now the factory owners, the middle class, versus the proletariat, the working class. He wants to eliminate all of those social classes. So again, he'll be in a different set of notes. So the Industrial Revolution is going to really spur the growth of alternative versions of economics. Okay, so are there reactions against the Industrial Revolution? Well, Karl Marx is going to be a great example. He'll be in a separate set of notes, as I previously said. But there will be more violent action against this industrial process. And there'll be three examples I'll use here. The first one are the Luddites. So the Luddites were historically skilled textile workers who lost their job to these textile factories. And in textile factories, you don't need skilled labor anymore. The machine's doing most of the work, so you can hire unskilled labor for lower prices, and you then fire the skilled labor. So these skilled textile workers were angry they lost their jobs, so they gathered weapons, axes, go to the nearest factory, and just destroy the machine. And they called themselves Luddites, and because they were led by this mythical figure named General Ned Ludd. They literally thought they were just being led into these factories by this, giant-like figure named General Ned Ludd to tell them to go destroy the machines in the factories. I don't know what they were smoking, but it must have been strong. So the British government's going to respond to this because it actually gets pretty intense. So they eventually pass laws saying the destruction of industrial machinery is a capital offense. You can be killed for it. And many of the Luddites, when they were arrested, put on trial, found guilty, they weren't necessarily executed, but they were sent to the newly found penal colony called Australia, which is going to become a favorite of the British government. To get rid of criminals without executing them, they will just exile them basically to Australia, and that eventually, is going to become a independent country later on, but you get the point. So the Luddites, they're really key to know that they're one of the first major examples of workers working collectively to try and address their own grievances. And that's huge. We saw the French Revolution is not super far behind this. So we already seen the workers banding together trying to destroy something that they believe is harming their quality of life. So the next one, the swing riots, are going to be similar. So the swing riots is going to be worker action against the mechanization of agricultural work. So in particular, that threshing machine, which was that automated way of harvesting grains. And basically, it's putting skilled labor out of work. And additionally, grain prices are dramatically increasing because the British government passed the Corn Laws, which essentially places a higher price on imported grains or corn and increasing the price of really all grains and corn and in Britain. So basically the economy is hurting. People are out of a job. So what do? Take out their anger against the thing that are putting them out of business. So these now unemployed agricultural workers find those threshing machines, destroy them. And when they would destroy the machines, they would leave the area. They would like put a little like note here, and this is actually a real one, saying this note was signed by Captain Swing. And very similar to the idea of General Ludd, they thought like Captain Swing was leading them to destroy these threshing machines. So once again, though, what's the importance? Again, this is collective worker action. The British government is going to respond by putting people on trial, but also look at what else they're going to do. So they're not just going to bring the hammer down. Because if you keep bringing the hammer down, that eventually might create the seeds of a revolution. The British government kind of knows exactly when to pass a reform bill to sort of assuage these feelings of animosity. So these swing riots are in 1830. The British government's going to pass the Great Reform Bill of 1832, which increases the franchise, the ability to vote, to now the middle class. And they're also going to pass the new poor laws. So they're giving in a little bit. And that helps kind of quell some of that revolutionary sentiment. Unlike in France, where they're just not going to do much and have a revolution every single time. So again, swing riots lead to, like, they're going to repress the initial, like, kind of riots, but the British government will pass a law to kind of quell that working class animosity. And then my personal favorite, the Rebecca riots. So these were in Wales. So that's like in the western part of the British Isles. And the context, 1840s, is going to be called the Hungry 40s for a reason. There's going to be an economic downturn. The impact of the Corn Laws is going to lead to higher grain prices, which means people are going to be starving. And the British government was building these like turnpikes, basically, really fancy roads, and they were making them toll roads. Like you actually had to, pay a toll to go on it. So there was a group who hated that. So in this case, they dressed up as like women in dresses, and they would go to these toll gates and just destroy them. And then they would like actually put the toll gates on trial. Yes, I know, as crazy as it sounds. And they would read like a biblical passage involving the name Rebecca, and then they would destroy the toll gates. So they're just hilarious people in hindsight. So once again, though, we see like working class consciousness trying to attack the thing they believe is making their lives worse. So, once again, what does the British government do? Like, they are going to, like, increase the troop presence, stop the riots, but the British government will pass a law to kind of really quell this animosity. So the most important one is the British government does eventually repeal those Corn Laws, which will then bring down the price of grain, and that's going to help reduce, not famine, but starvation. And that's going to be huge. So the main takeaway is the British government knows when to pass a law to prevent full-on revolution. The French do not. Okay, almost there. So, another major impact of Industrial Revolution is this growth of a new political group called the Chartists, Chartism. So the context is the working class, remember the working class people working in factories, and they were upset that they didn't gain the right to vote in 1832. Only the middle class did. The middle class are the people who run the factories, not the working class. And they teamed up with 6 pretty liberally minded members of parliament, and they make something called the People's Charter of 1838, and it has 6 very simple demands. And as you can tell when you read through these, it's meant to make the lives of the working class better, creating universal male suffrage, secret ballot, meaning your boss doesn't know who you voted for. That's important. If you want to be a member of parliament, don't have a property requirement. So you can have, maybe regular people in parliament, not just really rich ones, maybe. Members of parliament should be paid, because if you're not paid, can average Joe become an MP? No, probably not. Equal constituencies. So like there were some constituencies that had more power than others. That's important. And then make sure every MP gets elected every single year. And that's kind of important too. So eventually the Chartists, they become more and more popular with the working class. Let's see what it turns out into. So the working class is going to now, the Chartists are going to submit these demands to Parliament, and Parliament's like, okay, and they reject it. So there's some violent rioting, and then the Chartists now got a petition for Parliament to, use these 6 demands. They got 3 million people to sign it, which is quite a bit, and then Parliament rejected that as well, which leads to more strikes across Britain. And now the British government steps in. They start arresting the Chartists, exiling some to Australia, yet again, very famous. And then they sent another petition. The British government rejects it again. And now Parliament literally just says, you can't actually have public meetings or else you're going to be accused of treason. So basically the British government is going to bring the hammer down here. But I do think the Chartists kind of get the last laughs here. So why will the Chartists not actually become a thing in the short term? One, the British government did respond with a pretty heavy hand. And additionally, the British Parliament does pass some laws that make the lives of the working class better, as you can see here. So again, British government is giving in just a little bit to quell that revolutionary sentiment. So the Chartists will wither away. But what's our takeaway? One, this is truly the first working class movement in Europe. And they are not going to be the last by any means. And out of those 6 demands, eventually the British government will actually take them and actually make laws out of 5 of them. And that's huge. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take into the 20th century to do that. But truly, they are well ahead, very progressive for the 19th century. And additionally, the Chartism will help lead to the growth of labor unions that will help fight for, again, higher wages, better working conditions, and eventually a political party in Britain will really be the party of the working class, arguably, called the Labour Party. And today it's the 2nd largest party in Britain, 2023. All right, folks, that is it. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you are still awake. I'll see you later. Bye.